Chapter 19. The night air felt as if it were getting colder as he and Liam crouched in the shadows of Macduff Castle. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a painful reminder of Thelma's absence. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the ancient stones, transforming the once majestic structure into something sinister and foreboding. Warren's eyes darted across the castle grounds, taking in the scene before him. Where earlier the area had been swarming with men, now only a handful remained, their shovels biting into the earth with rhythmic precision. The reduction in numbers sent a jolt of hope through his weary body. "Liam," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the scrape of metal on stone. "Do you see? There are far fewer men than before." Liam nodded, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the area. "Aye, and that's our chance. We'll skirt around the edge, opposite where they're digging. Stay low and follow my lead." With smooth precision, Liam began to move along the castle wall. Warren followed, his muscles protesting because of the beating he had taken just days ago. They inched their way forward with painstaking caution. The darkness played tricks on their eyes, transforming innocent shapes into menacing figures. Each step was carefully placed, the crunch of gravel underfoot sounding impossibly loud in the tense silence. Their hearts pounded in their chests, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they remained hyper-aware of their surroundings. As they neared the corner of the castle, voices drifted towards them on the night breeze. Warren strained his ears, desperate to catch any mention of Thelma. "Waste of time, if you ask me," one voice grumbled. "We've been at this for hours and found nothing but rocks and more rocks." "Shut your gob," another voice hissed. "The boss says we dig, unless you fancy explaining to him why we stopped." Warren felt Liam's hand on his arm, pulling him back into the deepest patch of shadow. They pressed themselves against the cold stone, scarcely daring to breathe, as a figure rounded the corner. It was the supervisor, his face etched with lines of frustration and fatigue. He paused, surveying the work before him with a critical eye. Then, seeming to come to a decision, he barked out an order. "You there! Jones! Head down to the cave and see what's taking so long with that water. And tell that lazy sod to get back here pronto. We need every man if we're going to find this bloody artifact before sunrise." Warren's heart leapt into his throat. The cave. They were holding Thelma in a cave. Without thinking, he surged forward, ready to chase after the man who could lead him to his wife. But Liam's iron grip held him back. "Easy, lad," he murmured, his voice low and urgent. "You go charging off half-cocked, and you'll get yourself killed. And where would that leave Thelma?" The mention of his wife's name was like a bucket of cold water. Warren sagged against the wall, the fight draining out of him. "You're right," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "But we can't just let him get away. He knows where Thelma is." Liam's eyes glinted with determination in the moonlight. "We won't, but we'll do this smart. The path to the cave is on the other side of the castle. We'll circle around and follow him from there. Less chance of being spotted that way." Warren nodded, forcing himself to take a deep breath. He had to stay calm, stay focused. For Thelma's sake. "Lead on," he said, gesturing for Liam to take point. They moved with agonizing slowness, every step carefully placed to avoid loose stones or dry twigs that might betray their presence. The night seemed to press in around them, full of unseen dangers and lurking threats. As they rounded the far side of the castle, Warren caught sight of a figure moving down a narrow path that led away from the structure. His pulse quickened. This had to be the man they were after. "There," he breathed, pointing. "Do you see him?" Liam squinted into the darkness. "Aye, I see him. We'll have to move quickly if we want to keep him in sight. But remember, we can't get too close. If he spots us, this whole thing goes up in smoke." Warren nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I understand. Let's go." They set off down the path, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The terrain was treacherous, uneven, and strewn with loose rocks that threatened to send them tumbling with every step. But Warren barely noticed the danger. His entire being was focused on the shadowy figure ahead, the man who might lead him to Thelma. As they walked, the sound of waves grew steadily louder. The path began to slope downward, winding its way towards the coast. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, and a chill wind whipped at their clothes. "We must be getting close to the shore," Liam muttered. "Keep your wits about you. Caves near the water can be dangerous, especially at night." Warren barely heard him. His mind was racing, conjuring images of Thelma trapped in some dank, dark cavern. Was she hurt? Scared? Did she think he had abandoned her? The thoughts drove him forward, pushing his tired body beyond its limits. They had been walking for what felt like hours when the path suddenly split in two. Warren pulled up short, his eyes darting between the two options. "Which way?" he hissed, panic rising in his chest. If they chose wrong, they might lose their only chance to find Thelma. Liam held up a hand, his head cocked to one side as he listened intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the crash of waves and the whisper of wind through the grass. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps on loose gravel drifted from the right-hand path. "There," Liam said, pointing. "He's gone that way." Without hesitation, they set off down the right-hand path. The terrain grew even more treacherous, the path narrowing until they were forced to walk single file. Warren's feet slipped on the damp rocks, and more than once he had to catch himself to avoid tumbling down the steep incline. But he pressed on, driven by a desperate hope. Each step brought him closer to Thelma, closer to ending this nightmare. He could almost see her face, could almost hear her voice. Warren's urgent whisper cut through his thoughts. "Look there." Ahead, barely visible in the gloom, a dark opening yawned in the face of the cliff. The cave. They had found it. Warren's heart thundered in his chest. Thelma was in there, he was sure of it. Every fibre of his being screamed at him to rush forward, to call out her name. But Liam's steadying presence held him back. "Easy now," Liam murmured. "We don't know what we're walking into. We need a plan." Warren nodded, forcing himself to think rationally. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What do you suggest?" As Liam began to outline their approach, Warren stared at the cave entrance. "Hold on, Thelma," he thought fiercely. "I'm coming for you. Just hold on a little longer." The thunderous crash of waves against the rocky shore drowned out all other sounds, enveloping Warren and Liam in a cocoon of white noise. The salty air stung Warren's nostrils as he struggled to keep his footing on the increasingly treacherous path. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the urgency of their mission. "Liam," Warren called, his voice barely audible above the roar of the ocean. "The ground's getting steeper. Watch your step." Liam nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Aye, and our friend's picked up his pace. We can't afford to lose him now." As if on cue, the henchman they'd been following disappeared around a sharp bend in the path. Warren's stomach lurched with fear. Had they lost their only lead to Thelma? "Quickly," Liam urged, already moving forward. "But quietly, mind. We don't know what's waiting for us around that corner." Warren followed, his muscles screaming in protest as he forced his tired, aching body to keep moving. They crept to the edge of the bend, pressing their backs against the cold, damp rock face. Warren held his breath as Liam cautiously peered around the corner. "Mother of God," Liam breathed, his eyes widening. "What is it?" Warren demanded, his imagination conjuring 1,000 terrible scenarios. "Is it Thelma?" "Is she?" Liam shook his head, cutting off Warren's frantic questions. "No sign of her yet. But look for yourself. Carefully now." Warren inched forward, his heart in his throat. As he peered around the rocky outcropping, he understood Liam's reaction. While they had located the entrance to the cave, they had not seen the path to get to the cave. The path ahead had narrowed to a precarious ledge, barely wide enough for a single person to traverse. On one side loomed a sheer rock face, slick with sea spray. On the other, Warren's stomach churned as he looked down at the dizzying drop to the churning waves below. "Good gravy!" Warren muttered, instinctively pressing himself closer to the relative safety of the cliff. "How are we supposed to follow him across that?" Liam's face was grim in the dim moonlight. "Very carefully, lad. Very carefully indeed. But we've no choice if we want to find your Thelma." The mention of his wife's name steeled Warren's resolve. He nodded, squaring his shoulders. "You're right. let's go. They inched their way along the treacherous path, their backs pressed against the cold stone of the cliff face. Every step was a battle against vertigo, the roar of the waves below, a constant reminder of the consequences of a single misstep. Warren's palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the rough stone, his fingers searching for any handhold that might offer some security. The wind whipped at his clothes, threatening to unbalance him with each gust. "Steady on," Liam called from ahead, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of wind and waves. "We're nearly there. I can see the path widening up ahead." Warren gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. He refused to look down, focusing instead on Liam's back and the promise of safer ground ahead. One step at a time, he told himself. After what seemed like an eternity, the path began to widen. Warren's legs were shaking with exertion and leftover adrenaline as he finally stepped onto more solid ground. Ahead, he could make out the dark mouth of the cave, a faint flicker of light emanating from within. "There," he gasped, pointing. "That must be where they're holding her." Liam nodded, his expression cautious. "Likely so, but we can't go charging in blind. We need to assess the situation first." They crept towards the cave entrance, every sense on high alert. As they drew closer, Warren could make out the murmur of voices from within, punctuated by the occasional sharp command. "Can't have gotten far," a gruff voice was saying. "Find her, you idiots. The boss'll have our hides if she's not here when he returns." Warren's heart leapt. Thelma. They were talking about Thelma. But what did they mean? Find her? Had she escaped? Before he could voice these thoughts to Liam, another voice rang out, closer this time. "You there? Check the entrance again. Make sure she didn't double back somehow." Liam's hand clamped down on Warren's arm, pulling him back into the shadows just as a figure emerged from the cave. The guard passed within inches of their hiding spot, oblivious to their presence in his haste to follow orders. As the sound of the guard's footsteps faded, Liam whispered, "Now's our chance. We'll slip in while they're distracted searching for Thelma outside." Warren nodded, his heart racing with a mixture of fear and hope. They edged towards the cave entrance, the flickering light growing stronger as they approached. The cave opened into a larger chamber, with 3 dark tunnels branching off in different directions. "The center tunnel," Liam murmured, indicating the source of the light and voices. "That's where we'll find answers." They crept forward, hugging the wall of the cave. The rough stone scraped against Warren's back as they inched along. As they neared the entrance to the central tunnel, the voices grew clearer. "Incompetent fools," a man was raging. "How could you let her escape? Do you have any idea what the boss will do to us if we don't find her?" "We'll find her, sir," another voice replied, trembling slightly. "She can't have gone far, not in her condition." Warren's blood ran cold at these words. What had they done to Thelma? He surged forward, ready to confront them, but Liam once again held him back. "Wait," Liam hissed. "Look." Warren followed Liam's gaze. There, in the center of the chamber, stood a large metal cage, and kneeling before it, examining the lock, was a man Warren didn't recognize. In that moment, all rational thought fled from Warren's mind. All he could see was the cage where he just knew Thelma had been held. All he could think about was what these men had done to his wife. With a roar of rage, he broke free from Liam's grasp and charged forward, ready to unleash his fury on Thelma's captor. "Warren, no!" Liam's shout echoed through the cave, but it was too late. Warren Bishop, history teacher turned avenging husband, hurled himself at the surprised man with all the force he could muster. As they went down in a tangle of limbs, Warren was aware of shouts of alarm, of Liam cursing colourfully behind him, of the scrape of metal as weapons were drawn. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was finding Thelma and making these men pay for what they'd done. As fists began to fly and chaos erupted in the cave, Warren silently prayed that he hadn't just made a terrible mistake. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of rage as Warren hurled himself at the unsuspecting henchman. His fists, clenched so tightly he could feel his nails biting into his palms, came down with all the force of his pent-up fear and frustration. The satisfying thud of knuckles meeting flesh, barely registered through the red haze that had descended over his vision. The man stumbled, caught off guard by the sudden assault. He tried to turn, to face his attacker, but Warren was beyond reason, beyond mercy. He tackled the henchman to the ground, straddling him as his fists continued their relentless assault. "Where is she?" Warren roared, punctuating each word with another blow. "What have you done with my wife?" But the man beneath him couldn't answer, even if he'd wanted to. Blood streamed from his nose, his lips split and swelling rapidly. Still, Warren couldn't stop. Every punch was for Thelma, for the fear she must have felt, for the pain these monsters had put her through. Dimly, he was aware of Liam's voice, shouting at him to stop. But it was distant, unimportant. Nothing mattered except making this man pay, making them all pay for what they'd done. It wasn't until Liam's strong hands gripped his shoulders, physically hauling him off the now unconscious henchman, that Warren's frenzy began to subside. "Enough!" Liam yelled, his face inches from Warren's. "He's out cold, lad. You'll kill him if you keep on." Warren blinked, the red haze slowly receding. He looked down at his hands, knuckles split and bloody, then at the man on the ground. A wave of nausea washed over him as he realized what he'd done, what he'd been capable of. But there was no time for self-recrimination. Warren staggered to his feet, his chest heaving as he sucked in great gulps of the damp cave air. He delivered one last kick to the prone figure, more out of frustration than malice. "Thelma," he gasped, turning towards the cage that had been the focus of the henchman's attention. "She must be." The words died in his throat as he saw the empty cage. It seemed to be mocking him with its emptiness. No Thelma, no sign that she'd ever been there at all. Warren's knees gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, a keening wail of despair tearing from his throat. "No," he moaned, his voice cracking. "No, no, no. She has to be here. She has to be." Liam's hand on his shoulder was meant to be comforting, but Warren barely felt it. He leaned forward, retching, his body rebelling against the crushing weight of his failure. "Why?" he choked out between heaves. "Why is this happening? God, why?" But there were no answers forthcoming, only the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs and the echo of his own ragged breathing in the cave. As Warren's wiped his tear-soaked eyes, something caught his attention. A glint of metal on the cave floor, barely visible in the flickering light of the lanterns. He reached out, his hand trembling, and picked up the small object. A hairpin. Thelma's hairpin. Warren gasped, his heart leaping into his throat. He recognized it instantly, the delicate filigree work, the tiny pearl at one end. He'd watched Thelma slide these into her hair 100 times, always marveling at the deft movements of her fingers. "Liam," he breathed, holding up the pin. "Look, it's Thelma S. She was here. She was here." Liam squinted at the small object, then nodded slowly. "Aye, it could be. But Warren, we need to." But Warren was no longer listening. A wild hope had taken root in his chest, pushing aside the despair of moments before. "She must have escaped," he said in a rush. "That's why the cage is empty. That's why they were searching. Liam, she could be close. We could find her." Liam opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. His eyes widened in alarm. "We've got company," he whispered. "Move, now." They scrambled to their feet, Warren clutching the hairpin like a talisman. They made it to the cave entrance just as shouts echoed from one of the other tunnels. 3 men burst into the chamber, their eyes widening as they took in the scene, the unconscious henchman, the empty cage, the 2 intruders. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Then Liam's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Warren, go! Find Thelma. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Warren hesitated, torn between his desperate need to find his wife and his reluctance to abandon his friend. But Liam was already moving, positioning himself between Warren and the approaching men. "Go!" Liam roared, and this time Warren obeyed. He burst out of the cave and into the night, the cool air a shock after the stuffy confines of the cavern. For a moment, he teetered on the edge of the narrow path, the sheer drop to the churning waves below, making his head spin. But there was no time for fear. Warren turned left, scrambling up the steep incline that led away from the cave. His legs burned with the effort, muscles protesting. but he pressed on. "Thelma," he called, his voice barely audible over the crash of waves and the pounding of his own heart. "Thelma, where are you?" The wind whipped around him, carrying away his words. But Warren refused to give up. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Thelma was waiting. And he would find her, no matter what it took. As he climbed, Warren's mind churned. Had Thelma really escaped? Or was this just another cruel trick, another dead end in this nightmare? The hairpin seemed to burn in his hand, a tangible reminder of what he stood to lose. "Hold on, Thelma," he muttered, more to himself than to the night. "I'm coming. Just hold on." And so Warren Bishop pressed on into the darkness, his heart full of fear and hope in equal measure. The path ahead was treacherous, the future uncertain, but one thing was clear: he would not rest until Thelma was safe in his arms once more.